All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome again to Marquette University Law School. I'm Mike Goucher, and this is On the Issues. This is our continuing series of conversations with news and policymakers, people doing interesting, important work in this region and beyond. Today, we are joined by the President and Chief Legal Officer for Microsoft, Brad Smith. He is responsible for Microsoft's corporate, external, and legal affairs. Just to give you a sense of Mr. Smith's responsibilities, he leads a team of 1,300 business, legal, and corporate affairs professionals working in 55 countries. He plays a key role in representing the company externally and in leading the company's work on a number of critical issues, including privacy, security, accessibility, environmental sustainability, and digital inclusion, just to name some of them. The New York Times, in a profile, called him a de facto ambassador of the technology industry at large. Won't you please welcome Brad Smith to Marquette University Law School. Good to have you. So let's get the important stuff out of the way first. Show them your device here.
It's not only a Microsoft Surface, it has a keyboard for your favorite tool.
There you go. So he is from Appleton originally, and remains a Packers fan. Can I say that, or is that going to get you in trouble in the Seattle area?
Well, I'm already in trouble in the Seattle area, and I have to say, part of the reason I'm in trouble is I still have not recovered from the call in the 2012 game where the fake refs, I mean the substitute refs, threw the game against the Packers for the Seahawks.
Notice that knowing laughter in this room.
Exactly.
People still remember.
Can't let go of that.
That's right, exactly. And I found out something before we came into this room. I knew that the CEO of Microsoft, Satya Nadella, is a UWM, had got his master's degree at UWM. Brad is from Appleton, but you said you have a third person from Wisconsin in your leadership ranks.
Yeah, Kathleen Hogan, who heads our Human Resources Department, grew up in Wauwatosa. So basically, 3 of the top dozen or so folks in the company all have these Wisconsin ties. And Satya has a University of Wisconsin red cap in his office. So when the 3 of us are meeting in his office, we sometimes take a moment to acknowledge that.
So you've been with Microsoft since what, 2002 or so?
No, actually since 1993.
93?
Yeah.
Okay. So
I was named general counsel in 2002.
So I'm sure we have some law school students in this room, and I'm sure they would want to know how someone who's a lawyer by trade ends up with one of the world's powerhouse technology companies. How does that happen?
Well, I had an early affinity for computing. I loved computers. I was still in law school. This was in the early 80s. I found that I could write better, I could write faster. And when I was with my law firm in Washington, D.C., I basically insisted on getting a computer on my desk to accept the offer to go there. And this was at a time when that wasn't happening. The management committee had to approve it. They said, "What's wrong with this guy? Doesn't he know we have secretaries?" And so everybody knew that I had this love of computing. And over the years, that opened the door to first do work for the software industry when I was working in London, to work with Microsoft as a client. And then in 1993, they said, "Why don't you move from London to Paris and lead our team in Europe," which I did.
And what do you find today is the part that you love most about the work you do at Microsoft?
Well, we live in a time when technology is not just changing quickly, but it's touching every part of society, it's touching every part of our lives. And because of that, there are these enormously wide-ranging societal issues. And whether those issues manifest themselves in law or policy or politics or you name it, we find ourselves at the center of this. And it is endlessly an opportunity to just think about where things are going, where law and government should go, and where we hopefully can go as a company to contribute in a positive way, not just in one country, but frankly, globally.
Let's talk about where things are going. I mentioned to Brad when we talked on the phone about a week and a half ago that I'd taken part in a conference here in Milwaukee, an economic forum, and the keynote speaker was a gentleman by the name of Vivek Wadhwa. I guess you could call him a Silicon Valley thought leader. He's a former tech entrepreneur and academic. He just writes a column for the Washington Post. But somebody who looks at the future. And he described the future for us at that event. And he said it was full of amazing and rapid technological change in the next 10 to 15 years. He talked about artificial intelligence, and he talked about robots, and he said, it sounds like a science fiction world, but it's happening right now. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, from the perspective of Microsoft, what do you see coming in general terms in technology in the next 10 to 15 years?
Well, first, let's just talk about the technology itself. It is changing rapidly. Part of it is computing is going to the cloud, as we say, meaning that we're all relying increasingly on this enormous computing capacity in data centers. If you're using Gmail, for example, your email is stored in a Google data center. If you're using Outlook.com, it's stored in a Microsoft data center. So we all rely on the cloud every day. Your pictures on your phone are stored in the cloud. And that is continuing. But the other thing that's really happening is we're using more devices in our lives, more devices in a day. And the technology that is going forward and how we interact with computing is changing. Increasingly, speech recognition is getting to a point where there are more scenarios where you can talk to the computer and it understands what you're saying. You can not only touch a computer, but increasingly vision recognition, image recognition. Just think about what it will take to have a fully autonomous vehicle. One of the things that it will take is cameras in a car that are connected to a computer that will be able to recognize when a soccer ball goes into the street and when an 8-year-old boy follows it. And the computer has to recognize the image, it has to discern that that is a human being, and it will have to make an instantaneous decision. Does the car stop? Does it swerve left? Does it swerve right? There are enormously important aspects of just computer science development that are going forward that will just profoundly change how we rely on computers to do things, how we interact with them, and frankly, how we sometimes will worry about whether they can really do the job we're asking of them.
So our reliance on devices, on the technology, will continue to grow and grow. And you mentioned the word the cloud, and your company's actually written a book. It's a cloud for global good. And that's the question. You want this changing, rapidly changing world to obviously benefit as many people as possible. Do you have concerns that that is going to happen?
Well, the first thing we've tried to do is something that I personally think is a little different from what you hear sometimes from tech companies, especially on the West Coast. Inevitably, every era of technological change has impacts that are good, but also creates new challenges. And we have to recognize both sides of the coin. If we just go forward and say, hey, these things are coming and the world is going to be better and everything's going to be great, we're going to miss a lot of what we need to think about and talk about societally. So we think we need to recognize both. And then we really need to act, I believe, with a sense of shared responsibility, meaning those of us in the tech sector have to ask, what is our responsibility? What do we need to do? What do people in government around the world need to do? What do people in nonprofit organizations need to do? How do we come together to really think through and act together to address the challenges as well as the benefits?
Do you see us having those conversations right now, or are we kind of in our silos and we're not having the important conversations we need to be having?
Well, let's just say there's a lot of room for improvement.
Yeah.
On almost any issue, I think there's a lot of room for improvement. It's sort of been a somewhat siloed year even, not just in the United States, in many countries around the world. And, as the dust settles from, call it a tumultuous political year, I think we should all hope that we can start to come together, perhaps even in a less partisan or at least more bipartisan way, and ask, where can we find common ground? Where are there practical solutions? How can we take one step at a time and then build on them?
I want to talk a little bit about what is often called disruption, and then we'll talk about how the tech industry might be able to help deal with some of this disruption. And I got to tell you that every time I hear that word, I always feel like that's a nice way of saying that a lot of people could lose their jobs, or jobs will be obsolete, or that some tough times are going to be had by quite a few people. You said that's something that we do have to consider. We just can't sit there and say, actually the presidential election, to some degree, was about that, was it not? That people felt like they were left behind.
Yes, I think that's fair. I sometimes get a little bit of heartburn because I sometimes find, especially in California, people talk about disruption as if it's an end and a goal unto itself. And I don't think it is, or it should be. I think change is inevitable, but we should address the change that will be good and then work through the adverse consequences. Let me just describe two scenarios, both of which we may well come to pass over the next 5 years. The first is, call it a disruptive change, but really that one that's just all positive and complements human activity. The number 3 cause of death in the United States is accidental deaths in hospitals. It's mistakes that doctors and surgeons make. It's easy to imagine, I believe, 5 years from now, that in a hospital operating room, there will be a camera that is connected to a computer. The surgeon may tell the computer what operating procedure, what surgical procedure is going to be performed. The computer will know all the steps in that procedure. The camera will be able to observe the surgeons and the nurses. And if they skip one, the computer can use its speaker, its voice, to speak up and say, wait. That is how computing can augment, complement human activity. Now, another scenario. You drive into McDonald's and you go to the drive-thru. You speak into a speaker where there is a human being today whose sole job is really to listen to what you say and enter your words into a machine so that your order can be fulfilled. With advances in speech recognition, it's not that difficult to imagine that that particular task, at least, will be performed by a computer in 5 years. And that person, if he's still or she's still at McDonald's, will be doing the other part of the fulfillment, but not taking that part of the order. So we have the opportunity to complement people, and there will also be aspects where human tasks are performed by a machine.
Well, part of this is about skills and education. And one of the things I know that you feel strongly about is this notion of digital inclusion. First of all, what do you mean by that? And give me examples of what we're talking about in terms of bringing people into this new world.
Well, I think that there are fundamentally 2 different aspects to this phrase, digital inclusion. One is, do people have access to digital technology? I think it's fascinating if you look at a map of Wisconsin and look what the state has put out in terms of wireless broadband access. And you see in the southeastern state high-speed broadband access, and you see in the northern part of the state no broadband wireless access at all. It's very diverse over the state. So there's access to technology. But ultimately, I think the bigger question is providing people with access to digital skills. Wisconsin is actually like most states in the United States. There are 500 high schools in the state. Last year, the number that taught the advanced placement course in computer science was 80. So the students in 420 of the high schools did not have the opportunity to study that. The students in 80 did. And those students in those 80 schools are given a head start in really mastering, the language of tomorrow, I would say. There are other high schools that teach the advanced placement course in Latin. That is not the language of tomorrow. Let's just say that, even if you love Latin.
Like our dean.
Yeah, but it's not Latin. The language of tomorrow. So it should cause us all to reflect on what are the skills that people are going to need to be employed, and in part, what do they need in K-12? What do they need in terms of opportunities to get a 4-year degree? But I think the critical question that will be sort of the question of the next few years, I hope, are these so-called middle skills. Community college degrees, technical certifications, opportunities for people who are in the workforce today to learn new things, whether it's on the job or on their own or by going back to school. We're all going to need to keep studying. We're all going to need to keep learning just to keep pace with change.
Do we have, clearly, one might argue that we don't have the workforce we need for tomorrow. Are you optimistic that within the boundaries of this company, this country, we can fill the jobs that will have to be done, or do we have to look at abroad? Microsoft is big on having people come with engineering degrees, whatever, to help in the work.
A couple of thoughts. I mean, first, Microsoft is relatively unique in the tech sector. First of all, we spend more on research and development than any company in the world, about $12 billion. And we spend 85% of that in the United States, so we're much more concentrated in the US than most companies. Now, we're able to do that in part because a third of our employees have come from 157 countries around the world. So we build a world-leading research and development set of centers here in the US, in part with great local people, Americans, and in part by bringing people from the rest of the world. But in terms of optimism, I think that, let's just say, there is cause for optimism if we can grapple with some of the big challenges. If you look at the data about job creation, and this, to me, is sort of the graph of 2016. If you look at a graph of job creation in the United States since 1989, meaning through Republican presidents, Democratic presidents, what you will see is the number of jobs in the United States held by people with a 4-year college degree has more than doubled in the last 27 years. It's gone up 107%. The number of jobs held by people with a community college degree has gone up 47%. The number of jobs held by people with a high school diploma or less has fallen by 13%. There are 7.3 million fewer jobs in the United States today than a quarter century ago for people who did not go beyond high school. So there is cause for optimism, I would suggest, only if we can help people of all ages sort of move up that ladder in terms of developing their skills and getting the kind of certification that will then prove to prospective employers that those individuals have what it takes to be hired.
Are you encouraged by what you see around the country? For example, do governments in various states get that? Do you see that they're placing priorities on that kind of education?
One sees very interesting innovation and leadership in places. It's fascinating because I think arguably the country that is at the forefront of some of this is Switzerland. Had an opportunity to spend a day and a half there a few weeks ago. They have an amazing apprenticeship program that's very connected with businesses. So that if you're in high school and look, you don't want to keep going to class 5 days a week, if you're in Switzerland, you don't drop out. You become an apprentice. You might become an apprentice in information technology. You go to work 3 days a week, you go to class 2 days a week, you get paid $12,000 a year, and you do not drop out. And similarly, you can make it out of high school and pursue an apprentice program that is more akin to what we have in community colleges. Switzerland is the one country where unemployment is below 4% and youth unemployment is below 4%. Now, what's interesting is over the last year in Colorado, the state government, the educational community, the business community, they all went over to Switzerland and they spent intense time studying this. And they're now getting this up and running in 3 school districts and 3 community colleges in Colorado. Their goal is to have 20,000 students a decade from now going through an apprentice program. I came back and I said, well, the good news is I don't have to figure out what works in Switzerland. We just have to figure out what works in Colorado. And then let's see what we can learn and apply in other places. I hope that there will be more of that experimentation. If this year maybe did nothing else, it taught us that there are people who feel left out, they feel left behind, and as a society, there's a problem we need to address. Let's think about solutions.
I want to talk about something that's very important to the culture of Microsoft, and that is diversity. I think I've seen quotes attributed to you that say that, that we can never fully, without a diverse workforce, without an inclusive workforce, culture of inclusion, we can never fully succeed. And I think you've said that about the country too. Without that same sort of philosophy, we can never fully succeed. I'd like you to elaborate on that.
Well, 2 thoughts. The first is, look, we're one of the most global companies in the world. Now, interestingly, we do almost all our product development in the United States. So we create in this country and we sell and support the world. That's the key to our success. It's a diverse world. One fact that I think I sometimes find myself pointing out, I'll be in Washington, I'll be in the White House or the Congress or whatever, and I'll sometimes say, well, you have to remember, only 4.5% of the people on this planet live in this country. 95.5% of them live somewhere else. If we want to create products in this country and sell them to the world, we need to understand our customers. And the thing that I'm always so struck by is that in a world where I think there's so many wonderful things about the United States and so many things that one can say that are subjective and difficult to prove. You can't necessarily persuade Chancellor Merkel that everything we say is great that she'll believe it's as great as we say it is. But there is one fact that I believe is objectively verifiable. There is no country that has a population that reflects the diversity of the world the way our country does. And so any day that we can harness that diversity to learn about the world so as to better create products and sell them to the world is a day when we are likely to create more jobs.
How do you see the diversity in your workforce contributing to innovation in your company? Is there a direct link that you can see?
I personally feel it, experience it all the time. I sometimes wish I could say, I can prove it. And when you work with a bunch of engineers who write code, they look for like mathematical proof. And I don't think you can find it at that level. But there's so much about product creation, about technology, or frankly, even being a lawyer that involves creativity. And so anytime that you can bring together people in a room to work together on a team that has differing ideas, that's a start. If you bring people together from different backgrounds, and maybe one person's from Wisconsin, one's from New York, one's from California, one's from the UK, the next one's from China, or diversity in many other ways. But if you start with people who have had different life experiences, who can think differently, that's a start. And then it's all about creating a working environment where people feel comfortable sharing their different ideas, building on each other's differences, finding common ground, and hopefully finding a common point where it's actually better than all of the respective points would be put together. They genuinely learn from each other. And that's where these insights come that just don't come through mathematical reasoning alone.
You believe that Microsoft is poised for growth, but how much growth can you expect right now, given sort of the uncertainty that has come with a new presidential administration?
Well, from our perspective, one of the things about being a global company, look, there's always some part of the world where things are going great, and there's always some part of the world where they're not. There are more parts of the world right now where there is probably, more political uncertainty. We manage through it, and we focus on the long term. We're not trying to create products, frankly, to just carry the day in the beginning of 2017. We are creating products for the beginning of 2017, but we're even doing more to create products that will probably see the light of the day in the year 2020 and 2022. The one thing I've learned, and it started when I worked with Bill Gates and then followed with Steve Ballmer, focus first on the long term. It actually eventually arrives. And if you stay focused on the long term, you're going to be successful on a long-term basis. Develop the capacity to manage through short-term ups and downs, but don't lose sight. It's all about the long term.
I asked the question in part because Microsoft believes in a competitive free market, a global free market, and the President-elect Trump, has been talking a bit more in, protectionist terms. He's saying that, we need to look at some of our trade agreements. And I've noticed the stock market's kind of looking at Microsoft in the last week and going, maybe they're not going to be the fair-haired child in all of this in a Trump administration. Have any concerns about that?
Well, look, if anybody knows exactly what we're going to be debating 12 months from now, let me know afterwards. I would love to hear it. There's a lot of uncertainty, but hey, look, we made it through Brexit. That was there will be another presidential election in 4 years. We all know that. There will be a different president in 8. It's going to be really hard to find a way to turn things around and keep the United Kingdom in the European Union. Every day we work with governments that are so varied. Yeah, I was in Morocco last month. That's a country that is managed by a king. It's a real monarchy. I was in China. That's managed by the Communist Party. Part of living in the world and aspiring to do business on a global basis is one does need to sort of meet people where they are. I think you need to have a set of principles and values that you know are your own, that you're prepared to hold true. You can't compromise away your values or principles, but you do need to serve the diversity of the world and not think that you can impose your principles and values on everybody with whom you do business.
I'll talk for a couple of moments about the balance between privacy and public safety. We're at a moment in our history where I think there is a nervousness amongst a lot of people in this country and in other parts of the world about the threat of terrorism. And yet, people who use your services and others want their privacy respected. How do you, as a company, balance those competing interests? Or are they competing?
No, there are days when they are on the same side, and there are days when they are in tension. We spent a lot of time really thinking about this, because I do think it is one of the really profound questions that we have to grapple with as a company that has over 100 data centers in over 40 countries, in which reside the personal information of roughly 1.2 billion people. And we did what we increasingly try to do. We try to define the principles that will guide our decisions. And we said there were 4. That we have to keep people's information secure, that we have to protect people's privacy with the recognition that it is their information, they own it, we are their custodian, we are responsible for its safety and privacy, that we are responsible for managing people's information in compliance with the law around the world so that we worry about that and they don't have to, and that all of this is really underlaid by a strong sense of transparency so that people know what is happening to their information. And so, the questions arise, frankly, on a weekly basis. They sometimes cross my desk. What are we going to do in this situation? What are we going to do in that situation? It is an environment that has led us 4 times in the last 3 years to file lawsuits against our own government, the U.S. government, where we felt we needed to stand up for transparency or privacy, either for American citizens or for our customers in other countries.
So is that, in your opinion, in the company's opinion, is that overreach by the federal government, or is it simply a reflection of antiquated laws? I think you and I talked about this. A lot of the laws, the legislation was passed back in the mid-'80s, and we're still using that in cases today.
I think that there is, in part, the classic swing of the pendulum. After 9/11, for lots of understandable reasons, the pendulum swung quite far. And I'm just not sure that there was the thoughtful public conversation that we've had since Edward Snowden took his laptops and flew abroad and published a lot of information. But I also just think that there is this other problem, and you're right to allude to it. Our privacy law was passed in 1986. Our computer security law was passed in 1986. I might point out, basically, the last big reform of the tax law was passed in 1986. The last really big amendment to the immigration law was in 1986. I wish I could go back to 1986. Ronald Reagan was president, Tip O'Neill was speaker. You had 2 parties, but 2 leaders who figured out how to hammer things out. And we just have gone 3 decades of enormous technological and economic change, and I would argue the law just hasn't caught up. And until it does, it puts enormous pressure oftentimes on the courts to apply old laws to new facts. And that's a tough thing to ask the courts to do. It does sometimes call on us to say, hey, we're prepared to go to court to try to get an interpretation that we think makes sense for the era in which we live.
We're in a law school. Maybe you can just take a couple of minutes and familiarize some of the people in this room with one of the cases you were involved in. This involved data that was stored in Ireland. And this is a big case, and maybe you can help us better understand what was at stake from your point of view.
Sure. Well, first I would ask you to think about this. Every person in this room has all kinds of information about yourself, your credit card information, probably your tax information, what you browsed on the web, what you bought on Amazon, you name it. And all that information about you is in the cloud. And there are days when that information moves from one country to another. we're all, I'll assume, virtually all of us in this room, Americans. We get up in the morning and we assume that our rights are going to be protected as Americans by our law. Well, there are companies from lots of other countries that are in the tech sector, a number of Chinese companies. If your information moves from the United States to China, do you want your information and your right to that information to be governed by US law or by Chinese law? If the Chinese government accesses it, does that give anybody qualms for concern? Well, now put the shoe on the other foot. We have data centers around the world. We store people's email in the data center that is closest to where they live. We have customers in Europe. Their email is stored in Ireland. And what we faced was a situation where the US government served on us a search warrant and said, we want those emails that are in Ireland to be brought back to the United States. The Justice Department said, even when they don't belong to American citizens or residents, and we want them turned over when we want that information, in this case for a narcotics investigation. And as it turns out, the people of Ireland, the people of Germany, the people of the Netherlands were not altogether enthusiastic about seeing the loss of their privacy being governed by their laws. And so we went to court and we said, we don't think that US search warrants reach beyond the United States. That's sort of been a traditional principle of sovereignty, and we don't think that Congress changed that principle when they passed this law in 1986. And we lost before a magistrate, and we lost before the district court, and then happily, in our view, we won 3-0 in the Court of Appeals this past summer in a decision that has been very broadly supported by the business community, by the privacy community, and I'll say most especially by governments around the world who basically say, yeah, that's the way we should work. We need a new generation of international law so governments can work with each other to get information. But until that day comes, we're not actually served by governments just trying to reach across borders into each other's data centers.
I was going to ask you, you mentioned the groups and people supporting you in this, but is it a tough argument to win in the public arena because of the fears that people have right now, and that they're concerned about their personal safety? And you're trying to argue the argument you just made. You're trying to convince people that there's perhaps a line that we shouldn't go past. But there are probably some people who say they just ought to turn it over. Turn over the information. Keep us safe. I don't care.
I think it's a really good question. And every time we bring a case to say that the status quo as it's being, say, applied, through sometimes what we regard as sort of overreach by the executive branch, every time we say that goes too far, we also think about what's a better solution, and we propose a better solution. So in this case, we proposed two solutions, and we pursued them both. One was new domestic legislation, which we were able to advance on a bipartisan basis in Congress so that the US government can reach data in another data center in another country when it belongs to a US citizen or resident. That seems reasonable. So that was the first step. And we got to the point before we won this case, we were already over 150 co-sponsors in the House, for example. But then second, we said, look, we need a new generation of international law, so that there's a new mechanism that governments can use to get the information they want, get it faster than under the legal systems that have existed today, but do it in a way that is more consistent with people's privacy rights. We took that to the White House, we took it to number 10 Downing Street in London, and happily, in my view, the US and the UK inked earlier this year a new bilateral treaty. And our hope is then to see that adopted and then see that replicated between, say, the US and Germany, the US and Brazil, the US and Japan. So we do need new solutions. I don't think it's enough for us to just say, time out, the status quo isn't working. But I do feel good that we're always trying to think ahead. I
want to ask you just a couple more questions, and then we'll take a few questions from the audience. I mentioned that one of your responsibilities is dealing with the question of environmental sustainability. These data centers require a lot of energy, but you're doing some interesting things on that front. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, it's a fascinating area because, in all honesty, it's something I knew basically nothing about 2 years ago. But this is changing as well. Our data centers around the world already consume more electricity than the entire state of North Dakota, the entire state of Vermont. So let's just say more than a small state in the United States. A decade from now, whether you're talking about Microsoft or Amazon or Google or Facebook, look, we may be each consuming more electricity than a mid-sized nation in Europe. So we better think about our responsibility, I believe, from a sustainability perspective. So what we did was we adopted 3 principles that we said would guide our work. One is that we would really devote more R&D money, energy, to making our data centers more efficient so that they consume less electricity, which is fascinating as an exercise unto itself. A third of the electricity consumed in data centers is just to control the climate. Well, guess what? You're running all these servers. They all give off heat. When you devise methods to circulate the heat, you consume less electricity. The second thing was transparency. We said we would publish information about our data center electricity use. And we published that information earlier this year. We said we'll keep doing that. And third and most important, we said we would commit to a higher usage of renewable energy, meaning solar, wind, or hydro. And we said we were at 44% of our total electricity use coming from those renewable sources. We committed that we'd get to 50% by 2018, to 60% by early in the next decade. Just yesterday, we announced the largest wind power purchase in our company's history. It will ensure that our data center in Cheyenne, Wyoming is entirely powered by wind. But interestingly, what we're also doing is taking the natural gas-powered diesel or natural gas-powered generators that we have next to the data center, because you always have to have a backup source of power. And we said, rather than requiring the local power company to build another power plant, we would make those accessible to the local power grid. So when they're in peak times, they can call on that. And we're looking at new ways to store energy and make that available to the local grid. So frankly, part of what we hope to do is not only make our data centers more sustainable, but do it in ways that support the grid, bring down rates for energy consumers, and contribute to a more sustainable approach overall.
2 things. You've got a busy day. He's going to be giving our NEAS lecture later this afternoon, so we appreciate your time. But you also had a busy morning. And one of the things you did this morning is you spent some time in Milwaukee, and you're talking to folks who are involved in the startup scene here, people trying to help young companies get off the ground and increase the amount of investment capital that's going towards this sort of enterprise. Do you have any advice that you gave to those folks that you can share with this audience?
Sure. Well, the first piece of advice I give is never trust somebody who's only been in the state for 12 hours. So it's like, hey, look, I'm a visitor and I'm happy to offer some thoughts, but you all know what you need, and I didn't come here to preach to people. I am struck by a couple of things. First, I was impressed as heck this morning at the Generators Incubator Space. This is something that didn't exist 5 or 10 years ago. I guess there's about 13 or 14 of these in the United States. I visit them around the world. They're basically spaces that are dedicated to startups, which basically means you walk into a space. They have 3 startups running, in Milwaukee, and what you see are a bunch of big tables with a bunch of big computers, and people who are, I don't know, mostly between the age of 22 and 25. And their dogs. Wherever you go in the world, you see their dogs. I'm struck by that. And they're getting a start. They've come out of college or they've come somewhere else with an idea. We have a generator space above our office in Berlin as but one example. And you see bigger companies and communities funding that first step. And then you see, though, these folks as they move forward, if they become successful, they have 5 employees and 10 employees, and then if they get past 10, they probably move to space of their own and they become a company and they hire more people. To see that here in Milwaukee is incredibly exciting. And so I think the question then becomes, how do you create more of those? And how do you turn them into companies that stay here? And the advice I would give is think about more opportunities for coding and computer science in K-12. Definitely focus on the colleges and universities. You will not find a vibrant tech community anywhere in the world that is not next door to a college or university with a good and probably growing computer science department. And the University of Wisconsin at Madison has had one of the leading computer science departments, but it's actually sort of been shrinking over the last several years. And I think that's worth at least talking about. And then think about how you build a venture capital community. Think about how you take economic development strategy at a county or city or state level, so as to sort of provide those skills that this part of the economy is going to need. And then think about the fact that every business is really becoming a digital business. Kohl's will have a digital retail experience. I mean, we're partnering with Lowe's. You walk into a Lowe's hardware store, if you want to redesign your kitchen, you can put on a HoloLens, and it will show you, an overlay of the real world with holographic images in the dimensions of your kitchen with those cupboards or these cupboards or a different color of cupboard. But every business has the opportunity, I think, to become more successful, and it all sort of involves plugging this ecosystem together and really nurturing it.
Any advice there are a number of law school students in here, any advice for them based on your own experience?
Well, I just think the piece of advice that I would share for law students is actually the piece of advice I would probably share for almost anybody. If I think about the people that I've had the opportunity either to work directly for or interact with who I would call truly remarkable. I'd put Bill Gates, Steve Ballmer, and Satya Nadella in that category. I'd put a Chancellor Merkel or a Justin Trudeau in Canada in that category. I've just been so struck. There is one trait that every one of these truly remarkable people have shared. It is the intense pursuit of curiosity. It is constantly learning about new things, constantly asking new questions. I mean, to go in and meet with these people and, seeing Chancellor Merkel a month ago when Satya and I went in and met with her, and just having her ask questions for an hour and a quarter. Where do we see technology going? What's it mean for this part of German industry? What's it mean for these issues in German society? Any day you can use whatever position you have, whether it's a position in a company or a government or just as somebody who can read a book or on the internet, to constantly ask new questions and learn new things. That curiosity, I think, is quite possibly one of the most powerful traits in the world.
Great answer. Let's take some questions from the audience. This is how we do this. If you're in the seating bowl, press down on the rim, not on the ball, but on the rim. Just keep your finger down on the rim. We'll be able to hear your question. If you're in the back and you have a question, Ryan is the gentleman with the microphone. Wait for him to come over. He'll put it in front of you, and you can ask your question. And again, keep the questions fairly brief, and we'll get to as many as possible. So does anybody have a question? There's a question. Okay, right here.
My question is about the workforce. Given the new administration and the nationalism, I'm wondering what's your insight about possible raising or lowering of the H-1B visas? Because I know you've had to have open facilities in Canada because it's hard enough now.
Well, I would say two things. First, look, I think our first goal as a U.S.-based company always needs to be to hire skilled people from the United States among our own citizens. But I sure as heck hope that we won't see a reduction in H-1B visas because we can't hire enough people today. I don't see the country on a path in the short term to fill the gap compared to what our industry and all of these other companies that are going to be having digital needs are going to need to look at. And so I would worry if the number of visas was cut back.
Mm-hmm. Other questions? Let me go over here, and then I'll come over this way. Yes, go ahead.
Is Microsoft too big?
Is Microsoft too big? Is the question.
No, no. It's the short story. You probably won't hear. You won't be surprised to hear me say that. The key is being nimble. And the most distinctive aspect of Microsoft is not the size, although it's probably associated to some degree with size. It is the diversity of our technology portfolio. And one has to have a strategy for managing a company, therefore, with a diversified technology portfolio. And that really requires having a clear vision for the strategy overall, the ability to delegate and empower the different leaders to be able to pursue their pieces, but then the ability to bring everyone at the top together as a team so that the sum comes together in a way that creates more value. It is not an easy thing to do. I will say, I have been impressed as heck by the way Satya Nadella, in less than 3 years as our CEO, has found his way, I believe, to a successful path. If we couldn't manage that diversity, then I think you would have an argument that says, gee, maybe it is too big. But given that I believe we have that capability, I hope that we will continue to grow.
Mm-hmm. Other questions? I'm going to go up here way in the back. If Ryan, can you help me with that? There's a gentleman back there with a beard, way in the back. Yeah, just please.
I heard on KQED the director of the San Jose Computer Science Museum, the Computer Museum, say that the most secure way to protect your critical data is hard copy. What's the role of hard copy in Microsoft's security practices, and do you have secretaries?
Let me just ask, when you say hard copy, do you mean paper?
Well, there's the old microfilm.
Oh, something that...
there are variations of it, but something that can be read without...
What's interesting, I mean, look, maybe, I mean, just like, maybe the most secure way to keep your money protected is under the mattress, but you're going to give up a lot along the way. It's fascinating because in 2002, only 25% of the world's information was stored in digital form. But by 2010, 94% of the world's data was stored in digital form. And the benefit is obvious. Just like if you get money into a bank, it can be lent out, it can go to work, it can contribute to growth, it creates more value. Data in digital form can be manipulated, it can be transferred, it can be subject to data analytics and machine learning. So I don't think there's any going back, absent the return to the Stone Age, which I hope none of us will witness. The key is to be great at keeping digital data secure. And that's where we have to just keep getting better and better. We need to get better in the industry. It requires that governments focus on cybersecurity. It requires that we work together across the public and private sectors.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
What books have you read recently?
Let's see, there's a wonderful book that I'm about 2/3 of the way through by a fellow named Ron White, which is the biography of Ulysses Grant. I just think he's sort of the greatest American president that most of us don't fully appreciate. Somebody who had these humble origins, who was sort of plucked out of obscurity and rose to huge success in the Civil War, that helped the country through what was almost certainly the most tumultuous time in the country's history politically, the presidency and almost impeachment of Andrew Johnson, and then pursued Reconstruction. There's this fascinating aspect in the book when you start to read about Grant's presidency, and there's a quote that says the two great issues of his presidency was how to achieve economic growth in a difficult time and how to address issues of race and diversity when views and feelings were so fractured. It's fascinating. So that's one of 3 or 4 books I've been reading. The other one I will just say, and I don't know if this is an audience that watches The Daily Show with Trevor Noah, but he replaced Jon Stewart about a year ago. And he just wrote a book about his life growing up in South Africa as apartheid fell. And so he came out to Microsoft about a week and a half ago. I interviewed him. I was playing you. And so I read the book. You read all of that book, right? Didn't you, Mike?
I did, actually.
Yeah.
I did.
And it makes the point I made earlier. Ask yourself, how does a young kid, poor as heck, born in apartheid South Africa, not only grow up, but end up as the host of one of the most popular comedic television shows in the United States? The answer, intense curiosity. So that's a fascinating book as well.
Let me go back here. Questions in the back? Yeah, hang on a second.
Do you see a future with artificial intelligence capable of a moral conscience?
That is sort of one of the great debates in computer science today. You know, will a computer develop any conscience? And then if it can develop a conscience, will it be a moral one? I can't claim to know the answer to that. I mean, right now, everybody in the industry and in the field of computer science says, don't worry, that's decades away. You know, decades eventually go by. It may not be a world in which any of us in this room live, but it will be a room where our children or grandchildren are living. I think we should be talking now, as we are, about the kinds of principles and values we expect of machines that assist us. And we've started to do that. I'm encouraged that a group that involves research leaders in Microsoft and Google and Facebook and elsewhere have come together to ask these questions. I think we have a lot of work to do to think it through. There may come a time, maybe it's not for a century, but there may come a time when computers develop a conscience, and if so, we better hope that it is some kind of moral conscience. And so the sooner we get started, I would say the better.
Was there another question back there? Yeah.
You've spoken about the importance of continuing education, retraining. Some comments where you think the educational process itself is going, virtual learning, distance learning, and so forth. And I hope you've read Grant's memoirs.
Yeah, no, it's a fantastic. I have actually about 10 years ago. There's a couple of things to think about, I think, with respect to technology tools and what it means for education. One of the things that I think we've learned in our industry is when you see new technology, you sort of ask, is it a product or is it a feature? Some of you may have used a word processor when there first was a product that came on the market that was called a spell checker. You could have bought it from Microsoft. It was called Microsoft Spell. It was a product. Well, pretty quickly, we realized it wasn't a product. It was a feature. It was a feature of a word processing program. You know, when online education first sort of exploded with these massively online courses, MOOCs, people, in my view, sort of said they're products. I actually think they're features. And by that, I mean, I think that there is no substitute for a level of interpersonal, in-person interaction. But if you think about how education can change so that the large lecture might be watched online and might be watched online in a more captivating way, it might weave together video and animation, and that might be the homework that a student does. So then the classroom time is focused on conversation and discussion and learning from each other. I think that is one trend that is emerging. I do think that there's a second aspect that's emerging that I'm incredibly excited about with our pending acquisition of LinkedIn. We're just waiting for final regulatory approval in Europe. And that is the ability to take more services, courses online, take some tests online, develop the ability for people to get certified online, to work with employers so that employers can use this platform and weave together ongoing education and training for their employees. So we can do a better job of helping people identify the skills they're missing, go get those and get them certified, and then help them connect with their next job opportunities and ultimately jobs. So I absolutely believe that technology has a positive role to play. And one of the things I very much am excited about and hope is that we at Microsoft will be one of the leaders in what I see as this emerging field.
Let me take one or two more. Yes, over here. If you could just hang on a second, we'll get you a microphone.
We're increasingly aware that technology has addictive properties and that it can change human cognition. And what's Microsoft's role and what's the role of regulation in controlling that addictive dimension?
Well, I first think it's something we need to think about. We need to understand it. We need to understand, do some kinds of technologies or features, contribute to problems more than others. Ultimately, though, I will say this, technology is a tool. Benjamin Franklin invented in this country the mail, and then criminals invented mail fraud. People invented the telegraph, and criminals invented wire fraud. Now there's internet fraud or addiction, and what you ultimately realize is that every tool in the world, whether it's a hammer or a computer, can be used for something good, and it can be used for something bad. As the maker of the tool, I don't think that absolves us of responsibility. We have a responsibility to think about how we contribute in a positive way. But at the end of the day, it's up to every individual as to how they're going to use the tool. It's up to parents to think about how they want their kids to use those tools, how they want to use those tools themselves. One of the fascinating things about all communications technology, or even transportation, is that it brings together people who live far apart, but it sometimes divides people who live close together. People may live in the same house, they may sit on the same couch, they may watch the same TV show, and they may be talking to different people on their phones and not talking to the people next to them. But the only people who can change that are the members of the family themselves. And so we need to do our part, but heck, we all need to do our part.
Let me take one final question, and then we'll wrap things up. Yes, go ahead and press down on the, on the rim. There you go. Thank you.
That's it? Okay. Yeah. This is relating to the future and transportation. Is anyone looking at the future of cars that fly or building cities, in the sky and having a whole new transportation or
There
a residential system?
Yeah, no, there are a couple of startups actually that are actually designing and building prototypes of flying cars. I don't know what to make of that. We've said we're not going to build autonomous cars, so I don't think we're going to be building anytime soon an autonomous flying car. We definitely want to and are providing a lot of the technology that will enable these things. Ever since any of us watched George Jetson in a cartoon, we've had this image in our head of how neat that would be. There may be a day. I frankly would say let's first get let's get our roads up to snuff. Let's get the potholes paved. Let's get autonomous vehicles that work safely. And then let's think about what comes above that, and there will be a day when that comes. But I don't think that's going to be this decade. I doubt it'll be the next one.
Speaking of potholes, you've actually said that's something with the new president. There's a lot of talk about infrastructure. You said that's something that you feel very passionately about, that we need to do something.
Yeah, I thought it was fascinating that in a year when the two presidential nominees didn't really agree on very much, they did agree on the need to improve our infrastructure. And heck, I'm struck. It just seems odd to me that we can drive down a highway in South Africa that is bigger and smoother than one in Milwaukee or Seattle or somewhere else in the United States. We do have real issues with our bridges, our roads, our airports. I don't know why we feel in this country that it is simply impossible even to dream about the kind of high-speed trains that people in Europe take for granted, even though there are parts of this country, including between Seattle and Vancouver, where this would just generate, in my view, a lot more economic growth. And it's always controversial, and you have to ask where the money comes from, or should it be in tax incentives. But heck, look at, I'll take myself at the age of 57. Yeah, I think, 50 years ago when my parents were driving me in the car, we were probably on some roads that are in a little better condition than they are today. And I don't think that's the infrastructure we should leave to our kids. We should aim higher than that.
All right, so here are the final points. Let's say hi to his parents who are here from Mequon. Raise your hand and say hi. It's great to have you with us. And how about a 30-second preview of what you're going to be talking about later today as part of the Nice lecture?
Well, what I'm going to be talking about this afternoon, it definitely builds on this. It's the fourth industrial revolution, all of the technology changes that are coming about, how we think about what they mean in terms of law and the responsibility of technology companies, to ensure that we have a cloud for the future that's trusted, that's responsible, that's inclusive. And I'll share some thoughts both about what it means for the world, but also some data from Wisconsin.
It's great. Brad Smith is the President and Chief Legal Officer for Microsoft. Once again, nice round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great to see you.